Trump says the U.S. is very close to a nuclear deal with Iran. The Americans secure the release of an Israeli soldier from captivity. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is flashing all the red lights. And we have a crowded Mensch Award nominee shelf today. That's always a good thing. I'm Anit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. It's unholy, 2 Jews on the news. Yoni, we should probably let daylight in upon magic.
I knew you were going to say
that. Did you know that I would use that phrase? Because we do obviously talk about what we're going to do on the podcast, and normally that remains in the sort of text WhatsApp exchanges between us. But we thought, maybe the only resolution of this is for us to sort of bring it out before the audience. The conversation, the debate between us was over what we actually begin with. And I confess that we were sort of, torn in 2 directions, because on the one hand, there's obviously in the news, you do what's new and what's latest. And then there's also the press of what's ongoing, but very, very important. So I was making the case that the situation of dire hunger in Gaza and the warnings of an imminent humanitarian catastrophe, if it's not already started, just blot out the sun. That's the only thing going on, and that we have to talk about that first. And obviously there is another pull in another direction, which is in terms of what's new and late and the latest.
Yes, of course. And so that was... we don't normally do this on the podcast, have a conversation about our conversation. But as you said, it was more accurately a lively discussion into the pretty wee hours of the night on what we should run with. And you made the case, which I can't really, vehemently disagree with, that the Gaza story should run first. I tried to say that from the Israeli perspective, there are 3 big stories happening this week. One, of course, is the release of Idan Alexander, a very happy moment. The other is a terrorist shooting and killing Tzela Gez, a mother on her way to give birth, a very tragic story. And of course, a huge story, which is Trump's visit to the Middle East, which keeps grabbing headlines here. And all of that has a lot of significance. I think you making the point that that is exactly the issue, right? That the gap between us and the geography and where we're situated reads or gives us a different running order or a different lineup. But news trumps all, I think. That kind of, at the end of the day, is the conclusion. So perhaps we can begin with what looks like a very close deal. Trump saying the U.S. is very close to a nuclear deal. We'll add to that a top Iranian official saying to NBC News that Iran would forgo highly enriched uranium in order to get to a deal. So it does seem like this is where this is heading. There are, I think, some in Israel not incredibly happy by that development, and generally not happy by the fact that Israel seems to be really cut out from everything going on, from the release of Idan Alexander, which happened on Monday, and Israel got the official notification on Sunday of an Israeli soldier being released, we should say. The Houthi deal, the direct talks with Hamas, the direct talks with Iran, the taking off this the issue of sanctions in Syria, all of this happening when Israel is not only not a player on the field, but not even in the cheap seats, right? We feel like we're the people living next to the stadium listening to the game. So that is where the situation is right now, and it is, quite concerning.
So obviously a lot of attention this week on Donald Trump's visit to the region, and we'll get into a lot of aspects of that with our guest this week, who is an expert on the whole area and has a really interesting perspective on it all. But I just want to focus first on this release of Idan Alexander and what it means for Israel to be entirely uninvolved in that, and for him to be out when those Israelis who are not citizens of another country are still held captive, what that really means. If you just take several steps back and think about what Israel's promise, what Zionism's promise was to its own citizens and in a way to the larger Jewish people, that whatever difficulties and terrible flaws that the country might have, it would be there as a kind of protector for some Jews, of last resort, but of first resort for Israeli citizens. Now that covenant was already badly ripped on October the 7th when people were waiting in sealed rooms and on kibbutzim for the Israeli army, and for many hours they never came. But this underlines the tearing of that covenant, in some ways even more dramatically, because Israel couldn't protect this young man who voluntarily moved from America, where he was doing fine, and volunteered to be at Israel's side and in its fight. Israel couldn't protect him, couldn't bring him home, but the US could. The passport that mattered for him was his US passport. And we know it's something that Jews joke about, Israelis joke about, having a second passport in the drawer. Well, this tells you, yeah, you really need one, because in your hour of most dire need, Israel's own government won't be there for you. Donald Trump will try to get you out. Bibi won't lift a finger for you. And I put it that strongly because there are clear signs, and there have been for months and months and months, that there are were deals, there are possibilities on the table for Israel to get those hostages home. And Bibi Netanyahu, as Amos Harel explained on the podcast last week, for his own political reasons, because he wants to stay as prime minister, does not want to end the war, he will not take those deals. So the message of this, and I hate to put it this starkly, is that Israel will leave you behind. If you want to get out and be safe in a situation like this, you need to have the insurance policy, in this case, of an American passport. I think that conclusion is a bleak one, but I don't know how else, in a way, anyone could look at it in a week where Trump gets someone out, and those people who do not have that passport, Israel has not helped them out.
There was a moment in the studio this week, Vicky Cohen, who's the mother of Nimrod Cohen, who's also a soldier, an IDF soldier. There are 3 of them still alive in captivity, together with Tamir Nimrodi and Matan Angres. We should say that Tamir Nimrodi, there's a grave concern for his life because there's been no sign of life from him. But Vicky Cohen, who is Nimrod Cohen's mother, was holding an Israeli passport. And she looked at the camera and she said, "This is the passport under which my son went to defend his country. This is the passport under which he should be returned and protected." And you're right that this is really a story in which an Israeli soldier is returned to Israel, and that is facilitated by the United States and not by Israel. A colleague of mine said this week, and I'll quote him, it's kind of a kick to the gut, but he said, Idan Alexander was returned not because of Israel, but in spite of Israel. And that is a really sad thought. I mean, you mentioned the fact that Israelis would always talk about the second passport thing. I never thought that would be a big deal, in the sense that, us Jews, we know we should always have a plan B. I think we learned that the hard way. But that doesn't mean anything unless you're in a situation like this, and this is what happens. And now it's up to the Israeli government to show its citizens that it can protect them in their hours of need. By the way, particularly if you are planning on a bigger operation in Gaza that will require reservists and many soldiers, you should be saying to all of these people, if something happens to you, we'll be there for you. And you're right to mention that the solidarity and what sort of defined us as a country was so frayed after October 7th, when it wasn't clear that the first thing that this country needs to do is bring back the hostages and protect its citizens. Now this takes this one step further. It's a very happy moment, right, for the country, for the Alexander family, this young man coming back, standing on his feet. But the circumstances here are troubling. I'll just mention one thing about his return. It's an interesting point. It doesn't have to do with the dual citizenship, but with the fact that the first thing he wanted to tell his parents is what happened to him on October 7th. The first thing he said was, I was encountered by 30 terrorists. And we see this, and psychologists mention this, all of the hostages coming back, even after a very long period of time. The one thing they want to talk about is what happened on that day. And when you think about it, they explain that all of us had the opportunity to process this, to digest this, to go through what happened. They didn't. They were all in survival mode. And so the first thing that they want to do is start processing this moment.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, that the idea that they're in a state of suspended animation, that their own experience of October 7th. I do think that in a way, and we get into this a bit in our later interview, but there is that the Trump administration were sending a bit of a message by doing this. First of all, they're saying, look, it's possible. You can do this. But also, I think there's something of the exasperation the Trump administration increasingly feels with the Israeli government, because Steve Witkoff, who's acting as this sort of shuttle diplomat and envoy, has made, I think it's pretty clear that there is a deal there to be done for the rest of the hostages. But what it will mean is that Israel moves to what we called phase 2 of the agreement brokered in January, which is an end to the war. And Netanyahu does not want to end the war. And the Americans, I think, more and more do want to see an end to it. But Netanyahu, again, quoting Amos Harel last week, that he needs the fire to keep burning, to keep his ultra-nationalist, I would say Cohenist coalition partners, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, in there, and therefore confronted with the choice of ending the war and releasing the hostages, or keeping his job but the hostages stay captive. Sorry, they're going to stay captive. And I think in a way, Trump and Witkoff were dramatizing that, making it very vivid. Here's one route. It gets you Eden Alexander. The other route is more death, more suffering, more torment for the Palestinians of Gaza, but more days in captivity and perhaps worse because of the risks for the hostages.
So you don't have to guess. We brought this quote this week. We published a quote that Steve Witkoff was saying to hostage families. And this is what he said. He said, "We want to bring back the hostages. Israel is not willing to end the war. Israel is extending the war, although we don't see where else this could move forward. We need to get to a deal." This is Steve Witkoff to hostage families. So this is what I assume that the U.S. administration is thinking. By the way, I have heard this week of all of the theories. One of them that is floating around is that Netanyahu and Trump actually are very much coordinated, and that this is his way, Netanyahu's way, to walk back from the war without his coalition falling apart, i.e. to say, the American president is pressuring me. We're going to have to end the war. There's no choice. This is the situation. Now, I don't see, let's say this is a game that Netanyahu would play if he could. I don't know if the latter part of the sentence is true, but, the former definitely is. One more note to make on Idan Alexander. His mother, Yael, which was also on this podcast and spoke beautifully, thanked many, many people who helped bring back her son, Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff. She thanked the Hostage and Missing Families Forum. She thanked the staff of the hospital that he was in. She thanked the Israeli people. She did not thank Benjamin Netanyahu. And that, created this really blanket of vitriol that landed on the family's head by the Netanyahu acolytes, saying not only that she's ungrateful, but also that her son was kidnapped under dubious circumstances, said the Tucker Carlson of Israel, who has a show on a network that isn't mine. So, that should also be mentioned. I would just say that the majority, the really vast majority of Israelis are incredibly happy that this kid is home.
Yeah.
And there were no dubious circumstances, just to be very clear.
No, the idea of speaking this way about people in that who suffer that plight. So let's move to the topic that you and I were sort of having our tussle over in terms of where we featured it. Always a trouble for journalists, I think, is the things that are ongoing rather than just immediate. And this has really been ongoing. But I have to say, outside Israel, this is the main event. This is the story that leads the radio and TV bulletins. It's what world leaders are talking about. I'm talking about the hunger in Gaza and the denial of humanitarian aid. French President Emmanuel Macron calling Israel's policy shameful, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni calling it ever more unjustifiable. A big hearing of the UN Security Council this week, in which the man in charge of humanitarian affairs, a British diplomat originally, Tom Fletcher, talking about that this is a step on the way to genocide. He used that word, but said that the Gaza Strip was confronted with a critical risk of famine and a very emotional appeal to do something, to take action. People are sharing on social media images of emaciated children, the sort of images that would be already tragic if this was a drought situation. But this is not an act of God. This is an act of Israeli government policy. And so, there's no hiding place on that. In April, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, said Israel's policy is clear. No humanitarian aid will enter Gaza. Blocking this aid is, he said, one of the main pressure levers on Hamas. Israeli spokesmen have been on the airwaves a bit this week, trying to sort of talk their way out of it. It's very, very difficult to do because the official statement of the government is that nothing will get in. When there are, military strikes on hospitals, as there were this week, you're always able to say, if you want to defend those, well, there was a Hamas command operation terrorist, hotbed there. You cannot say that if it's a policy of starvation. By definition, that targets everybody. It is the definition of collective punishment. And obviously, and we've just been talking about it, what happened on October the 7th is beyond heinous and evil. But a 5-year-old child who now cannot get enough to eat is not responsible for what happened on October the 7th and should not be punished for it. And it seems to me this is such a violation of Jewish value. We don't want to labour this point, but we have starvation in our history. In fact, even in our quite recent history. Last month at our Seder table, we sat around saying, "Let all who are hungry come and eat." We know about this, and yet Israel is beyond 70 days of a deliberate, stated policy of allowing no food into a place it, at the moment, controls access into and out of militarily. My last point is, I think Israel will be judged by this in the way, and this was mentioned at the UN Security Council this week, in the way of, Srebrenica or Rwanda. This is going to be one of those episodes that is remembered for decades to come. And last thing I'll say on it is that the International Court of Justice, you'll remember the Israeli judge, Aharon Barak, himself a Holocaust survivor, who was the ad hoc judge on that. When the International Court of Justice made its ruling back in January, Barak voted with the majority on two things. One was about language that could an incitement to genocide, and the courts demand that Israeli politicians do not engage in it. But the other one was humanitarian aid. And he voted for the bit that demanded, quote, immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Aharon Barak voted for that. And there's the defense minister saying no food. I think this is a huge, huge thing. And that's why I was arguing that, the news is massive. But in terms of what will be remembered and what is going to have a lasting impact, this, to me, is the central event of our moment and our time right now.
Before anything, I have to say that when you mentioned that we Jews have starvation in our recent history, I honestly thought you meant the hostages coming out from Gaza and looking like they're walking skeletons, not to in any way belittle what you were saying. I want to go through this, and I think the way to have this conversation, and I thought about it a lot since our discussion on what to discuss first, would be to perhaps look forward and not look back. Because I honestly think, and perhaps I am the incurable optimist in this conversation, that in 2 weeks from now, things will look very different. And again, perhaps I'm deluding myself, but I think that the urgency of the situation in Gaza is very clear to everyone, including to Israelis, the bellicose rhetoric by far-right ministers notwithstanding. We should probably go just a little bit into the weeds and say that there is a humanitarian mechanism that the U.S. and Israel are launching, which should let food in Gaza very soon. Barak Ravid did also report that is what Israel is planning. This mechanism, we should also say, is under a lot of criticism. It is not good enough. What is happening right now is that there are essentially organizations, NGOs, trying to facilitate, to talk with the humanitarian community, the UN, the aid agencies, and Israel to try and fix the deal and make it a better mechanism. Because Israel and the UN can't talk to each other. There's too much bad blood there, quite literally, one should say, and we can go into why. But the thing that they're doing, and I spoke to a few of those representatives of those aid agencies trying to facilitate this conversation, is to say, look, there aren't enough points of distribution. You have to distribute food in the northern part of Gaza. And there are other problems with this plan that need to be fixed. Essentially, the feeling is that this plan or this mechanism was leaked before it was completely phrased in the right way. If indeed the former executive director of the World Food Program, who's David Beasley, will head this, and we should say this whole thing should be called, this whole foundation is called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's a new organization. Again, I know that this has its problems. But the intention is to have private companies distributing the food, private security, making sure that the food does indeed get to the people it needs to get, and the Israeli military in the perimeters of this. I know, I kind of anticipate what you will say, and I know the criticism. And I've heard the speeches in the UN. None of them ever mention, for example, that Emily Damali, a survivor of captivity, was held in an UNRWA facility and never taken care of. That is always somehow slips. Just an example. But I think that the UN should also be looked at as a body that has its own politics and that right now is contemplating whether or not they should or would or could be part of this mechanism. And as long as they're not part of it, they will have a lot of criticism. If they do indeed, as the US and Israel want, join into this, then it will have less criticism, I imagine. But no one, I think, again, if they're not far-right ministers, doesn't understand that the situation at this point is beyond urgent. I think this is very clear to everyone in the military and to everyone dealing with it. That is my sentiment. And again, perhaps I am completely wrong and optimistic.
You know, I hope you're not wrong, but I do think that that's the rosiest possible take on this. For one thing, 2 weeks. I mean, I don't think the people who are starving have 2 weeks, and that's my problem number one. The second one is the volume of food, but also, what are we even talking about here? This should be unthinkable and off the table as a weapon. The fact that that it wasn't one of the fringe ministers; it's the defense minister, a Likud minister, saying this is going to be one of the main pressure levers. It isn't attacking Hamas. It's attacking the population. It is collective punishment, which is, I'm afraid, a war crime. It should have been off the table. There should be no discussion now. Israel should be saying, knock yourself up, flood the zone with aid. Whatever our issue is with Hamas and we want to see them destroyed, it is not legitimate to, as part of that fight, starve the children, the disabled, the elderly of Gaza. There should be not even a negotiation. And, when they say, but Hamas take it and they use it and they loot it, if that's what it takes to make sure people aren't starving, then you let that happen. That is a price worth paying. This should be morally beyond the bounds. It should be off limits. And instead, Israel, and this is what it will be judged by, said that for 70 plus, and if we add 2 days, it will be 85 days, it was okay. It was a tool in the armory to starve 2 million people. And I think that is a stain on Israel and on all people who are implicated in it.
I'm not going to defend what the defense minister says. I am going to say that from what I'm hearing from Israeli officials and from the defense echelon here, indeed, the urgency of the situation is very clear. After flooding Gaza during the ceasefire, it is now clear to everyone that this needs to be solved and resolved. And I, again, think that in 2 weeks from now, we will be having a different conversation.
And just on that point, I would direct people to the article published in the New York Times this week by Ronen Bergman and Natan Odenheimer. Headline, in private, some Israeli officers admit that Gaza is on the brink of starvation, citing an internal analysis that says a crisis looms if food supplies are not restored. So I think even what military officials are saying publicly and what they're saying privately can vary.
I have this premonition, and on this, I'm definitely not going to be wrong. We will revisit this topic very soon. But now we want to do something quite impossible, which is enter the head of the American president and understand his thinking, or at the very least, accompany his visit here in the Middle East. And we think we have someone uniquely situated to do that with.
Dr. Sanam Vakil is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, the international affairs think tank based here in London. Her expertise spans Iranian and Gulf politics, the security dynamics of the Middle East, and US foreign policy. So really the ideal person for this of all weeks with Donald Trump's visit. Welcome to Unholy, Sanam. We're very glad to have you on. I mean, we thought we would just start with the very latest news, these reports that are emerging from Donald Trump saying that he's very close, his words, very close to a US-Iran nuclear deal. Very interested to know just what you read into that, what you're hearing, and I suppose how likely it is that in the end anything he gets is going to be pretty much the same as was already in the so-called Obama deal, the JCPOA, nearly a decade ago that Trump broke from. So start with that.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you both. These are definitely fascinating times to watch the Middle East and watch U.S. engagement in the Middle East, and specifically looking at the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. I think that there's cause for optimism, but also for a lot of caution. Really, because I think there's momentum for a deal, there's interest at the highest levels, both in Tehran and Washington for a deal. But the technicalities of a new deal, a better, stronger, longer deal, seem to be hard to understand. The U.S. position is not quite fully formed. It's a sort of unconventional approach to come to the negotiating table, but the goalposts keep moving. And that's because there's certainly an internal debate in Washington among President Trump's closest advisors in his administration over the scope and scale of this deal, with stronger and longer, really not just designed to impose permanent nuclear restrictions on Iran that would ostensibly prevent Iran from enriching uranium, but also go beyond the nuclear components and also include regional dynamics and Iran's ballistic missile program. And I think the neocons around the president, such as the Secretary of State, have been pressing for further constraints, whereas the president himself and perhaps J.D. Vance, his vice president, and his best friend come negotiator Steve Witkoff really see a nuclear-focused deal for now as being what's achievable. And if we look at the details, I think, again, we can arrive perhaps at a document of principles, and that could be arrived at relatively quickly, where Iran would commit, as it did in 2015, to never pursue a nuclear weapon, and commit to stop enriching high degrees of enriched uranium. But again, the technicalities of the when, where, who, and how wouldn't be ironed out. And that's really what's problematic from a technical level and from a sustainability level.
Mm-hmm. You called it unconventional. I think that might be an understatement. But definitely this seems to be an administration that perhaps doesn't go into the weeds, definitely not like the Obama or then the subsequent Biden administration. And the fact that, again, from the Israeli perspective, Israel has basically been cut out from this story. The Trump declaring that the direct talks are happening with Netanyahu sitting there, I don't want to say as props, but as a backdrop of that announcement. How concerned do you think Israel and the region should be that the United States is so, wants this deal so much, the Iranians want it, but the details are not really finalized. We're not sure what they will be signing.
Well, I think that not having alignment on the details, the scope and scale is very problematic. But this unconventional president in the White House has clearly shown us over the past 100+ days that he's willing to tear up playbooks and do unconventional things, deal directly with Hamas, have a back channel with the Houthis. this is an administration that sees convention, if not history, as having hindered American interests. And this is a president that's, I've been told, not looking to manage Middle Eastern problems, but solve them. And perhaps this requires, this is me being as positive as I possibly can, throwing out the old playbooks and trying new things, including discarding the history and the technicalities. I think that for a deal, though, to be sustainable and address bilateral interests for Tehran and Washington, but regional interests, obviously the technicalities need to be ironed out. But I will caveat this to say that clearly deals such as this, similar to the JCPOA, are compromises, and that requires the region, including Israel, to understand what a compromise is. This is not going to be a submission. And so thereby the Israeli demands of Iran submitting to what is referred to as the Libya model is just never going to be achievable.
I mean, we're obviously not got the details, but nothing in what you've said persuades me that in the end, once all the details are done, it won't be any different, and it certainly won't be better, as it were, than the deal that was already there that Trump tore up.
Well, I think that what I hear is that both the U.S. and Iran are trying to think of new workarounds and ways to make the deal sustainable and longer, i.e. perhaps a perpetual commitment, if you will, not one that has sunsets, which is problematic and was one of the issues with the JCPOA. But secondly, inspections can be managed in a different way, embedding the United States more directly into the process so that the U.S. is enforcing accountability. I think the economic dynamics are also quite interesting. That's not just to appeal to the U.S. president and his deal-making sensibilities, but really this is a president that sees economic connectivity as a bridge to security commitments. So again, having the United States be more involved is how you make sure the security contours are guaranteed. On enrichment, of course, again, I don't see Iran completely rolling back its program. That's just not going to happen. That wasn't achievable the first time. That's why it took so long for the JCPOA to be negotiated, because if you go back 20 years ago, the initial U.S. position was zero enrichment. And that led to obstruction, including multiple rounds of resolutions at the UN Security Council against Iran. And it's only when the Obama administration actually changed their position on zero enrichment, acknowledging that Iran has an indigenous right to enrichment per the NPT, that there was a compromise arrived at. So I don't see the Iranians immediately or over time accepting zero enrichment. There has to be some sort of maneuverability to really enforce oversight and accountability over a reduced enrichment capacity for Iran. I think that's as good as it gets.
And just in terms of the sort of specific bargain that might have been struck this week, we know what Donald Trump got out of it, with one starting with a spanking new plane, by the sound of things, a flying palace to be the new Air Force One.
You sound jealous.
Yeah, it's very much my aesthetic, Yonit, as you know. It's very much my style. But also, it seems that he was able to, through them, to broker the release of the US-Israeli citizen hostage, Idan Alexander. So we know what he got. Those are two very important things for him that he got. What do you think he gave to the Qataris in return?
That's a very good question. I think that it's important to see Qatar as supported by the United States, not just President Trump, but I think in a bipartisan way. And I think the Qataris have achieved that. The fact that Qatar was included on this presidential state visit abroad, I think, was also important symbolically. 8 years ago, the president went to Saudi Arabia, obviously also to Israel, but this time he anchored himself strongly in the Gulf and really showcased that it wasn't just Saudi Arabia that was an important Gulf ally for the US, but also the UAE and Qatar. And I think that sends a very strong message internationally, regionally, but also to each of the states that they're all important for the United States and all play complementary roles, if you will. The United States has been in the process, I think, for quite some time of calling on its allies and partners globally, but particularly in the region, to burden share in managing regional conflicts and crises. And these three Gulf states have really been trying to pull their weight, show their relevance, and I think are going to be carrying the burden of stabilizing the Lebanese government, managing and helping to support Ahmed al-Shara in Syria, back channeling with Trump, but also with Iran. There's, while tensions are in a better place than they have been in quite some time in the region, there is a lot of work that is taking place behind the scenes on all of these crises. And we haven't even spoken, of course, about Gaza, that very much are driving their concerns and security dynamics across the region.
You mentioned Syria, so I would want to ask you about Abu Muhammad al-Julani or Ahmed al-Shara, and that the president called him, and I quote, a great, young, attractive, tough guy with a strong past. So what do you think the United States is trying to do there? Is it trying to decide the past is in the past and we are trying to make him a moderate? Does that stand a chance in any way?
I think the meeting with Shara and lifting of U.S. sanctions on Syria has been a really interesting example of the weight and the lobbying of Gulf states on the U.S. government. And it's been a really successful case study, if you will. This is perhaps a gift to the Gulf, a request that has been on the table from a number of countries who see the stability and the cohesiveness and the centralization of power under Ahmed al-Shara as important, not just for Syria's political evolution and internal stability, but more broadly for regional stability. None of these states would like to see Syria atomized or become a venue for regional competition between Israel and Turkey, as we've seen, between Russia, Iran, and Gulf actors. And so Syria's long-term stability is, I think, a vehicle for broader regional stability. And the lifting of sanctions for a country that is bankrupted and people that have been truly impoverished over Assad's brutal tenure is a bit of a breathing room to give this government some foundation to work on, but also an opportunity for Gulf states and Turkey to help support and manage that relationship without the influence or impact of spoilers. And we know in the Middle East there are plenty.
That's for sure.
I mean, we just have to imagine what would have been the reaction in Israel if a President Kamala Harris had gone on a Middle East tour and not gone to Israel, had suddenly shaken hands with the leader of Syria, had said, we're going to send 140 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. And as I say, not even the courtesy of a visit to Israel. I mean, they would have gone kind of crazy at all that. Yet here it is, Donald Trump doing all of this. It looks quite deliberate, this cutting of Israel out of the loop. Big decisions that, even including the release of the Idan Alexander hostage without, the first Israel knew of it, we're told, is when they heard about it like everyone else. What's your reading of that? Does it look to you like a decision? And does it come from something almost personal, that Trump is just exasperated by Netanyahu personally and perhaps by the war in Gaza, which, as far as he's concerned, is just going on too long? What's your read of the exclusion of Israel from what we've seen this week? Well,
I don't know about the personal dynamics far beyond what I see on television. And I can say that the last meeting in the Oval Office between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump looked very awkward and uncomfortable. And after the Zelensky meeting, I would put this one as second in awkward dynamics that are worth watching and examining. I do think that the relationship and where we are, it's unsurprising, but certainly astonishing, probably for the Israeli government, maybe even for Israelis. I think that there was an underestimation of President Trump. I mean, I think if we think back to 8 years ago, it wasn't a fluid or happy dynamic either. So this shouldn't be surprising. But obviously, this president has come into office with priorities that I think people are misreading. This is a man that is looking to prioritize American interests, and he's clearly frustrated by Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach in Gaza, but his unwillingness to play ball with what I think Trump sees as giving Israel already a relatively long runway to play with. I think the patience is running out, and obviously the United States doesn't want to be seen in the same way as the Biden administration was, as supporting unequivocally Netanyahu's war in Gaza at a level where, of course, relations were quite frustrated and Biden looked weak. I think that's one dynamic. But secondly, the humanitarian conditions in Gaza are really catastrophic. And again, here, I think that this is a president that doesn't want to be held responsible. He's certainly not going out of his way to solve the situation or to provide aid in Gaza as well. That's important to note. But he's trying to distance himself. And I think perhaps through that distance, send messages to Israelis as well as the Israeli government that, he's running out of patience.
It's hard to follow because he spoke not very long ago of, driving out the Palestinian population, turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, having Americans coming in. I mean, it's, and now it's a completely different tone, which sounds like he is very close to saying to Israel, enough is enough. Do you see any organizing principle here or anything that makes coherent sense?
Well, this is an administration that does have a strategy, but this is a president that trial balloons ideas, I think, without a strategic intent. I'd never thought that the Riviera of in Gaza and those very provocative statements were a license to drive out Palestinians and develop Gaza into a Riviera of the Middle East. I thought he was trial ballooning, and people too often take what he says literally. Just look at the 5 days of fury over and flurry of activity around renaming the Persian Gulf. He trial ballooned it. Obviously, everyone reacted in different ways. Clearly, it was fed into the system, and he decided, you know what, I'm going to take some time and reflect, and nothing happened. So obviously there's no process, or whatever processes do exist, we're not privy to them. The traditional ways of diplomacy are currentently not operational. I think what is very important is for the Israeli government to reconnect, and actually for the Israeli government to rethink its approach. Because to me today, Israel looks more isolated than it has looked in a long time. And thinking about the rest of 2025, and objectives tied to Iran are currently not on the horizon for Israel. I see a region in the Middle East, if not North Africa, if we want to throw them in, as wholly united against an Israeli campaign against the Islamic Republic. Everyone will do everything to make sure that attack won't happen, because they see it not in pro-Iran terms, but in terms of regional stability.
That's fascinating, because for a long while there were a lot of people in Israel betting on the idea that there was this sort of unstated crypto alliance of Israel and all the Gulf states, the Sunni states particularly, against an Iranian nuclear threat. And that if Israel did decide to take nuclear action against Iran's nuclear capability, they would all be silently cheering, and maybe not even silently, maybe helping in terms of overflights and airspace.
By the way, the way they helped with aerial defense when Iran attacked Israel, right?
Right. And so what you're saying there says that assumption has moved, it's no longer valid.
A couple of things to pick apart. First of all, just to nitpick on one thing, they're not Sunni states. And I don't think they like being called Sunni states. So, because they don't operate together and there are all sorts of dynamics. And of course, there are sort of ethnic issues and religious issues within all of these states. And so, and Iran doesn't just have Shia alliances and relationships. So I like to pick that one apart a little bit. Sorry for being pedantic. It works towards Iran's narrative if you lump them all together. Beyond that, I think that oftentimes the assumptions are not fully accurate of the regional dynamics. Certainly, there was cooperation in the attacks of where Iran was striking Israel in 2024. What struck me is that I think Arab states were participating more to support the United States, one, but two, immediately afterwards. And this is just how the rest of the region perceives it. And I think it's important to understand those worldviews and different narratives. The rest of the region immediately, explained or disavowed their cooperation. The region is not yet at a point where it's comfortable nor willing to be public about the level of cooperation or intelligence sharing that takes place. And until that happens, I think that's problematic for Israel. Israel shouldn't see Arab states as wholly reliable or partners until there is a bit more openness and confidence in the relationships. And that really can't happen until Gaza is done. So if Israel wants to facilitate that, it needs to think beyond tactical engagement in Gaza. So that's one. But two, how I think a lot of Arab countries are looking at Israel's military capabilities through the war in Gaza isn't wholly positive. Yes, of course, Israel had amazing intelligence and military capabilities against Hezbollah. There are many ways of looking at that. I would expect nothing less from Israel. This is Israel's sort of forte in the region. But the continuation of the war in Gaza and the military dynamics in Syria are seen to be very alarming and destabilizing. And I think that takeaway is that Israel doesn't have the capability to really accomplish what it says it wants to accomplish vis-a-vis Iran, that it will have maybe a short-term strike capability that it has learned that it is able to do since last year. But what is it actually going to achieve? Intelligence estimates say a couple of months of a setback with then perhaps broader consequences being regional security conflict or war, followed by, of course, the inevitable weaponization of Iran's nuclear program. So the calculation for the region is this is much more dangerous than finding an accommodation with Iran. And that's what they're choosing to do because they've lived through 19 months of war, but also looking at the sort of historical arc of external conflict dating from the 2003 Iraq War and recognizing that the instability is more dangerous than the diplomatic dynamics.
Dr. Sanam Vakil, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, actually, that was a really interesting exchange. And even her very justified correction on this point about Sunni states, we talked about it a tiny bit afterwards, really interesting. It turns out her view is that much of the region is now post-sectarian. She's just against this distinction, Shia and Sunni, and people applying it to the politics. Her view, other people I'm sure would take a different view, but her view is that it's no longer a useful kind of analytical tool, and these countries have plenty of ideological arguments between themselves and within, but they're not religious anymore. And she says that kind of notion of seeing it as Iran as a Shia thing or some of its rivals as Sunni is no longer the case. So she said it's a sort of hobby horse of hers, and very interesting to hear that view.
Yeah, and also, again, from the Israeli perspective, there are a few points to worry about whether this deal that it does seem like the United States is moving towards, fastly moving towards a deal with Iran. What does that mean if not all of the details are completely, closed? And I'm not sure Israel knows what all of the details are. And a few other points about where the region is heading and the fact that, this country should probably get on that train because it's not necessarily part of the conversation. We talked about this in our conversation as well. So I think that is quite worrying for anyone sitting here in Tel Aviv.
I would have thought so. And Israelis will want to hope, or will be hoping, that the neocon wing, Marco Rubio and others, prevail over the MAGA wing, because in her analysis, Rubio and others are pushing for a broader set of issues with Iran, curbing Iran's meddling role in the region and so on. Whereas it seems the MAGA folks just think as long as you get the nukes sorted out, that's enough. So in terms of the internal rivalry within the administration, Israel very much has a kind of dog in that hunt. But at the moment, it seems that the MAGA strain is prevailing, I would say. But really fascinating. We're very grateful to Dr. Sanam Vakil for coming on Unholy.
So right before we go into our awards, I had this funny conversation with our producer, Michal, this week, and we were saying, let's try and understand where Trump is heading. And, there are a few things that we don't know. And she said, let's, bring in like Mystic Meg or trying to guess that. And that led me to say, why not? This can't be a worse theory than anyone else's. And I opened up the USA Today horoscope for the president, who is a Gemini. And I thought, I'd read to you what it says, and maybe this will help us understand his thinking better than other tactics. So this is what it says. Passion and ideas sway hearts and minds under this cosmic weather. Others may not agree with you, but they trust you to handle business. It's a good day to resolve disputes. The horoscope on USA Today is basically telling us the Iran deal is done. It's a done deal. That's what I'm saying. So I also checked yours, but never mind.
It's become so hard. It's become so hard to work out what Trump's going to do that the horoscope astrology is as good a guide.
Why not Trumpology?
As any.
Why not
like
try that? So that's what I did. And I think that means
so.
the Iran deal is done. That's what I think. So
next week, Trump analysis through gematria and numerology from the Kabbalah.
Next week we read
because
Johnny Friedland's horoscope and see what it's actually. I know what it says. I checked that too. Yep. Anyway.
Did you? Is it good? No, you haven't told me.
Okay. It's pretty good. Yeah, it's like...
We'll have...
It is.
Okay.
Should I read it to you? It is. You're a Pisces.
Go on, why
you're
not?
a Pisces.
Yes.
Others know that you're good at what you do, but they may not know that you've achieved what you've achieved through perseverance and grit. Don't be shy. Let them know who they're dealing with. End quote.
See, I am shy on this, Yonit. I don't let you know who you're dealing with. I think this is very good advice for me.
I think so too.
I noticed you haven't given us your one yet.
I didn't because I don't really believe in the stuff. I stopped before getting into cancer.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
So, okay.
Suddenly you've become a skeptic now and it becomes you. That's I'm going to have to find that out.
This is a whole new vein
look.
for Unholy, I think. Yes, now, sir, you're free to go to the Mensch Awards.
So let's do that. Should we do to our awards? We always like to end with mensch, don't we? Should we do the chutzpah first? I think the man involved in this story, we have focused on him before, but the award will go to Russell Brand, who is a one-time comedian, actor, and now actually faces rape charges here in the UK. We should mention that, but he hasn't stopped him posting on social media. His latest one is in defense of Kanye West, who has some other name, which I'm not going to attempt to voice, who has released a song subtly titled Heil Hitler. Russell Brand decides that this needs his support and says, you have to celebrate voices like Ye's. Is it Ye? Yay?
I'm the wrong person to ask.
True artists that are willing to go into very, very difficult situations in order to tell the truth. So he's saying that Kanye West is a truth teller, Kanye West being the person who markets T-shirts with swastikas on them and who praises Hitler, who said once on social media he was going to go DEFCON 1 on Jews, etc., who is a sort of florid anti-Semite. And there is Russell Brand defending him. So I think it's a very, very mild response to that, to say a chutzpah award goes to him.
Yeah, you is mild. I have other words for that, but as you know, my parents listen to this podcast, so I can't say other words. Can we go to mensch, which is much nicer?
Much nicer territory. Go on, do that.
I think this story that was published on Channel 12 by our diplomatic correspondent, Eron Ker, is actually a very lovely story. Steve Witkoff, who lost his son, Andrew. He died at the age of 22, and ever since he was wearing his chain, the Star of David. After facilitating the return of Idan Alexander, he gave him this necklace and said that he would be honored if he continues to wear his late son's necklace. I thought that was a beautiful, just a very lovely gesture, and shows really how deeply this man cares about the hostages and about bringing them back.
Yeah, it's funny, Witkoff, because I go back and forth on him. He comes out of meetings with Vladimir Putin, parroting Kremlin talking points. I don't like that. But he does something like this, and you've got to warm to that. Yeah. And half of me just thinks, we those hostage families have had amazing relationships with Witkoff, early with Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. If only they could get a similar emotional affinity with the prime minister of the country, they would be feeling happier, I'm sure. Can I give another mensch nominee? Just in what is a crowded field? We just had to get this story in. Some listeners may not know that the University of Cambridge, since 1540, has had a Regius Professorship of Hebrew. Regius is a sort of particularly prestige chair because they were endowed by, as the name might suggest, the king. In this case, King Henry VIII created the role of the Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge. Since 1540, not one of those professors has been a Jew, despite it being the Professorship of Hebrew. But now, in September 2025, September of this year, the beginning of the new academic year, the new Regius Professor of Hebrew will be one Eron Ker, Koller, Koller, who will become the first Jew in the university's Department of Middle Eastern Studies to be in the role established by King Henry VIII. He is currently, we're told, packing up from New York City, where he's been a teacher at Yeshiva University. His big subject is biblical and medieval texts. He says, look, it's not really a surprise that there's never been a Jew in this role before, because the professorship was founded just at the same time as the Church of England after the break from Rome. And the whole point of it was for Anglican, for clerics, churchmen, to teach Hebrew for scriptural kind of Christian reasons. But now Eron Ker, who actually bears a striking resemblance to friend of the podcast, Leor Friedman. I recommend people to have a look at that. Eron Ker is to be the new Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge University. So we send a mensch award.
We do.
Alongside to both he and Steve Witkoff to the new professor.
Indeed, and this obviously means you need to send me the pictures of your mensch award nominees before we get on this recording. So we are winding up our conversation. We'll say our thank yous to Michal Porat, and you and I will meet next week.
See you then, Yoni.